When I'm deciding on a game to make a video on, and it's one I've never played before, I usually take some time to give the title a cursory look. Does it fit the vibe of the channel? Is it interesting enough to devote time talking about? And most of all, am I talented enough to actually finish it? Bioforge had me doubting that last point before I made it more than a couple of minutes into the game. Being one of the earliest examples of a 3D game on the PC, Bioforge came with all the pitfalls associated with breaking new ground. The controls were a complete mess. The gameplay was very trial and error dependent, and overall, if I could use one word to describe the experience, it would be unforgiving. Despite all that, this is a game made by Origin Systems, a developer famous for more hits in the gaming space than you can shake a cybernetic arm at. And while the grim futuristic setting was outside the usual fantasy games they were famous for, I have to imagine there was a good game beneath that rough outer shell. And you know what? I was right. This has to be one of the most memorable gaming experiences I've had in years. A story focusing on body horror, with a deep underlying mystery as you struggle for survival as a cyborg with no memory of who he is. Each new room filled with potential for grisly death and dismemberment. If that premise doesn't at least pique your interest, I don't know what to say. We may be very different people. The game gives very little preamble to start things off. The opening cinematic sees a ship land on a yet unnamed moon, and we're dragged unconscious into a facility that we would soon discover to be a true house of horrors. Something particularly memorable about this to me, especially for something released in '95, is that all the locations in this pre-rendered cinematic exist in the game world, and we would be venturing through them in the coming hours as we struggle to stay alive. It's a really nice touch that I've come to expect from a top-tier developer like Origin. Once inside the facility, the last thing we see is a man lowering his mask and going to work, tearing our body apart. The world fades to black. The real meat of this body-snatching odyssey is the story, and the game was even marketed as an interactive movie. But don't let that mislead you. Bioforge has gameplay, and my god, is it ever something. The closest approximation I can give for how this game plays is to liken it to the original Alone in the Dark, or to a lesser degree, the early Resident Evil games. I mean this in that you move through pre-rendered locations with fixed camera angles and tank controls. However, you're going to find the movement here to be far less forgiving, even when compared to those other titles. The turning and walking speed of our cybernetic protagonist is beyond slow, and we have the coordination of a drunken wombat. Why a wombat? Because it's a funny word. And just look at it. That is not a dexterous animal.
Cats are the featured animal of this channel. Get that wombat out of here.
Aside from moving slowly and lacking the ability to move in a straight line, the constantly switching camera angles make keeping your bearing nearly impossible. The game would see you moving through different parts of the moon base in an attempt to escape, and often where to go or what you could interact with was unclear. Everything sort of blends into the background, and while the game is not ugly, it's extremely pixelated, even for the time, and a lot of the backdrops do a poor job creating readable perspective, so telling what you needed to interact with became a bit of a guessing game. You sort of get a vibe of what was interactable by the mid-game, but early on it's a lot of spamming the interact button on things that look like backdrop. The earliest example of this is a reception desk towards the start of the game, where interacting with different spots on the desk will activate completely different things. Being as it's one desk, I expected one interactable object. Maybe that's just me though. Outside of moving through the environment, you of course had a combat system. And while there were a couple of guns you could get at points in the game, you were mostly going to be fighting in hand-to-hand combat. The way it worked was super interesting and wildly more complex than it ever needed to be. Essentially, when you want to fight, you press C to enter combat mode. And from here, you either hold Control or Alt and press a button on the number pad. Each button would use a different attack, with control-related buttons delivering a variety of low, medium, or high kicks, and the Alt buttons delivering punches, dodges, or even a completely unnecessary backflip. The system is cool, but it is superbly clunky. You can't interrupt your own attacks in any way, locking you into the animation once pressed. In addition, spam pressing will queue up another strike. So if you try to spam, you can lock yourself into multiple attacks. You do lock onto enemies in combat mode, but only sort of. If you give a little pause between your attacks, your character will adjust to face the enemy. But if you just attack non-stop, your bearing doesn't change. Your hits would often push enemies back, but moving in combat to close that gap could be a challenge. If you forget to release your attack modifier button, or just time it poorly, you'll just attack again instead of moving. It makes for a weird and stilted combat loop that can be difficult to time well. It sort of feels like an example of where the developers forgot they had an entire keyboard to work with here, limiting 90% of what you do to just the numpad. It does seem like they were trying to make the attempt to streamline the process in a game that was breaking new ground, but it just missed the mark a bit. The combat itself was somehow equal parts very easy, whilst also being nerve-wrackingly difficult. See, when you do land a hit, it's going to put your target into a pain state 100% of the time. So if you can get a hit in, and keep getting hits in, you could literally stun lock every single enemy in the game. And you will never face more than one enemy at a time, so don't worry about having to juggle multiple threats. What actually makes this difficult is twofold. The issues with the controls can make it difficult to land blows, and if you miss a hit and let your enemy past your defenses, you may as well just accept death, as they can be just as effective at stun locking as you are. On top of that, combat in this game is very drawn out. Enemies are extremely spongy, taking a huge amount of damage before finally dying. And that tankiness only goes one way. If they get a hold of you, it is startling how fast you'll die to their punches and kicks. Despite the many possible attacks and combos you are capable of here, with the difficulty of control and ease of death, I found it best to just pick one or two attacks and spam them ad nauseum. This would both make it more likely to land successive blows, and was the best way to reliably time your attacks. Personally, I relied a lot on constantly swapping between the mid kick to the head kick, kicking your enemies in the crotch, and then immediately kicking them in the face when they double over in pain is just good game design.
What a peaceful area. Oof! Ah! Oof! Ah! Ah!
This is a very mature channel with only the most highbrow humor.
The firing of guns was pretty basic. You just aim vaguely in their direction and press shoot. You could bounce shots off the walls sometimes, but aiming often felt more like luck than skill. And you can absolutely shoot yourself by accident if you aren't careful. As a cyborg monstrosity, we do have some very limited cybernetic abilities. And by very limited, I mean exactly 2. We can heal using limited battery power. This particular ability is available from the start of the game. It is very effective, but battery power is an extremely finite resource here, so you really can't be taking a ton of damage every encounter. Without spoiling anything, you absolutely can soft lock the main story if you aren't careful with your energy supply. The other cybernetic ability we have is Charge Shot, which you don't get until the very end of the game, and is worse than any of the other guns you'll find. It's also the only gun with limited ammunition. I used it one time ever. It's very meh. To be completely honest, this fighting system is objectively bad. but I had a blast with it. The strange, janky, almost slow motion combat encounters managed to be entertaining enough and remained intimidating right up until the end of the game. I died to literally the last enemy before finishing the title, and I felt I never truly mastered the system. On top of that, while combat is a constant throughout the game, there are really only a handful of actual melee fights. I'm far too lazy to go through my footage to count, but if I were to make a guess, I would say you need to fight less than 10 enemies in hand-to-hand combat throughout the entire playthrough. On a sort of meta level, I like to think that the handling of your character is so wonky and bad, not because of poor game design, but because the developers were simulating you getting accustomed to the cybernetic body you were so rudely forced into.
I never asked for this.
I'm definitely on copium here, but I still thought it was a good excuse for the controls. Outside navigating the world and combat encounters, the core gameplay loop here centers around slowly progressing through the Moon Outpost, making our way through a series of environments with the ultimate goal of escaping with our lives. Puzzles are a big part of the game. Some are what you might expect, with finding codes or solving problems with basic logic, but more revolve around having to solve a specific problem using the environment you're dumped into. Straight combat is almost never the solution in this game, and often failure to solve puzzles with pixel-perfect accuracy and timing will result in an instant death. As an example of one of these very unique puzzles, in the early game you need to get past an escaped lab experiment under the cryogenics bay. Simply approaching leads to an instant death, but if we go upstairs, we can read through some logs and discover there is a cybernetic raptor locked in one of the cryogenic pods. We can drain the cryofluid into a hole, which will awaken the raptor. We then need to knock the raptor down on top of a hatch, open the hatch to drop him down, and while he and the creature below fight, turn back on the cryofluid to freeze both of them. It's a really cool set-piece puzzle, and sets the tone for the rest of the game. It gets it into your head that there are going to be a ton of threats blocking your escape, and if you don't use your head, one of many horrifying deaths will await you. And there are some creative ones on offer. Beyond being torn apart by escaped lab experiments, we can be blown up, boiled alive in acid, be devoured whole, be struck by a meteor, or even just get shot to death by a mech. There is no limit to the creative ways we can meet our end. All that said, while the gameplay of Bioforge is weird and unique, the story is where this game truly shines. Our tale starts out exactly where the cutscene ended. We awaken in a cell watched over by a medical bot. We have no idea who we are or why we're here. We don't even know where here is. And if you want to find out the answer to any of those questions, we need to get past the robot intent on keeping us resting. A quick flurry of kicks and headbutts can send it into the bars of our cell, and grant us our freedom. Before leaving the room, we can grab a suspect piece of meat lying on the floor. I think it's a chicken leg. I wonder why so many games make the prisoner food of choice chicken legs. Like, just on this channel, this is the third game featuring some sort of drumstick. It's one of those weird things we just accept, but don't really question. Where is the chicken even coming from? We're on an alien moon. Maybe it's alien chicken.
I told you to stop with the chicken leg rants. It scares away the new subscribers.
Sorry, back to the body horror. Outside our cell, it becomes immediately clear something has gone wrong in the facility. We're being constantly shaken by tremors, and the entire cell block is vacant of any guards outside the nurse bots. The only other sign of life is a blue guy in the cell next to us, and he seems to have both cut his arm off and gone quite insane, resorting to the worship of a small fork in his cell. As this is a 90s puzzle game, you can bet we need that fork. Now you can go about this in one of two ways. You could beat your fellow prisoner to death and claim the fork through martial victory, or, if you feel like being a bit nicer, you can actually just put the chicken leg on the ground to distract him. Once he goes off to eat, you're free to pillage his cell to your heart's content. Before breaking into the next room, there are some logs lying around we can read to get a bit more backstory. It turns out the cell across from ours was occupied by someone named Dane, a supply ship worker who was captured by the group here. The moon base itself is run by a religious organization called the Mondites. Essentially, the Mondites are a group who believe in ascension through controlled evolution, so it should come as no surprise they have zero qualms with unwilling human experimentation to achieve those ends. We further discover the blue man in the cell across from us is a failed experiment named Kanan. He was a guard here and a Mondite himself, but he betrayed the organization when he saw what they were doing to prisoners. He tried to help Dane escape, but in his failure sealed his own fate as another piece of meat for the Mondite cause. The leader of the base here is Dr. Mastaba, and he is the one who did this to us. Unfortunately, the supply ship operator Dane is nowhere to be seen. The log here makes it seem as though he has not yet been operated on, but is probably only a matter of time. There is also a flute in his cell, and oddly enough we can play it perfectly despite being completely unaware of who we are. This is story relevant much later. We can escape the cell block by using the fork we found to pry open the door control panel. Then, get into the main facility using Kanan's severed arm to grant access. They probably should have revoked his station access when he betrayed them. Very poor cybersecurity policies. They should be ashamed. Worth noting here that every computer monitor is telling us the station is in the midst of an emergency evacuation. Turns out something has caused the station reactor to go into a meltdown, and a massive explosion is imminent. Also, our escape has been noticed, and a dropship of Marines is on the way to recapture us. We cannot catch a break. Out in the hallway is a giant mech guarding the elevator. For now, our best bet is to just sneak by, as we have nothing that could take down such a threat. Lucky for us, the thing is pretty stupid, and it doesn't seem to notice us when we stand still. At the far end, we reach the cryogenics bay. This is the part where we use a cybernetic raptor to take out the weird scorpion creature on the floor below. Once we move past the now frozen horrors, we can find a part of the ventilation has been torn through, and following the path leads us into one of the locked cells we couldn't access earlier. Inside is an apparently sleeping guard, and despite the chaotic nature of the moon base, he still decides it's worth his while to try and stop us. After some quick fisticuffs, we take him out and steal his gun. A blaster.
A blaster.
Calling an energy weapon a blaster is such a 90s thing to do. What's next? Are we gonna put on a backwards ball cap and head down to the skate park for a radical time? Using our newly acquired gun, we can take out the mech in the hallway above and get access to the elevator. On the top floor, we're greeted with more security bots, and can use some bullet reflecting to take them down safely. Once the floor is cleared, we can find a cowardly guard and an anti-air cannon. Punching the guard a few times gets him to activate the cannon, and we can shoot down the Marine dropship that was coming to reinforce the Mondites. Getting back on the elevator, Dr. Mastaba reaches out to us on the radio and says, "I'm the good guy here," and that someone named Dr. Escher is the one responsible for what's going on. But I mean, literally every other logbook is painting him as an evil psychopath who has mutilated and killed hundreds in his quest to fuse humans and machines into one. So we can probably assume he's full of shit? Finally moving into the surgical wing, our suspicions are confirmed almost immediately. As we come face to face with the Mad Doctor, he has some sort of remote control over us, and we are powerless to resist him. On the operating table with his brain open and arms replaced is Dane. The Doctor has us kill one of his own guards in cold blood, merely to prove the point that he controls us. But moments later, Dane is able to reach out and destroy the remote control, simultaneously freeing us from the Doctor's grasp and knocking us unconscious. We awaken to find the Doctor has left us for dead. Speaking with Dane, he wants to be killed. He's too far gone into the conversion to ever be human again, and he doesn't want to end up like us. The merciful thing here is to just end it for him. Sad. He had a whole backstory in his logbook, and a fiancé waiting for him back home. I knew he probably wouldn't have a happy ending, but it's one of the more tragic side stories in our journey. More fuel to keep moving and get justice. The next couple areas are big lore dumps filled with monitors and logbooks explaining more about the station. Turns out the Mondites are on this moon, now identified as Daedalus, because they found traces of a long-extinct alien race known as the Fix. Dr. Escher's journal reveals she is sort of here under false pretenses. She's only vaguely a Mondite, she really just wants to study the alien race, and greatly opposes the horrible things Dr. Mastaba is doing, but sees no way to stop it without becoming an experiment herself. The Mondites found an alien temple and gravity ring network on the planet, and even alien technology, which they've used to create a spaceship that has thus far been unsuccessful in breaking orbit. They think it's a lack of a proper power supply. This is going to matter later. Additionally, the Mondites and Dr. Escher uncovered actual living aliens in stasis. One such alien was transported to the holding cells we were in earlier. Unfortunately for the short-sighted Mondites, the alien didn't take kindly to being awoken and imprisoned, and caused the destruction we now see on the station. It tunneled through the walls into the reactor chamber, starting an overload that couldn't be stopped. The Mondites were able to trap the alien within the reactor, but the damage was done, and the station was now doomed. With all this new info, we need to at least slow the meltdown if we're going to have the slightest chance of escape. We can don a protective suit and head into the reactor where the alien awaits. There is no sense in fighting him. He is nigh indestructible at this point. Instead, we need to lure him onto an energy bridge and deactivate it while he crosses, sending him into the depths below. Surely this is the last we'll see of the alien. He definitely won't return for revenge later. With him gone, we can stabilize the reactor. This won't full-on stop the meltdown, but it does buy us time. And with that newly acquired time, we can move outside the station and make our way to the acid-filled crater's edge. An alien cube we found earlier in the flight bay can be used to platform between the strange alien architecture dotting the landscape, and we can make our way into the wreckage of the marine dropship we shot down earlier. Worth noting, the crater is home to this creepy beast that will swallow us whole if we get too close. I feel he'd regret eating us, as we're at least 50% metal, but I guess this thing also lives in acid, so who knows what it can handle. We'll deal with him in a minute. Inside the dropship, it seems everyone died on impact, with the exception of the Marine commander. He's not super happy with us, and we engage in some more prolonged hand-to-hand combat. When he dies, we get access to the bridge of the ship, and using the controls here we can launch a missile at the lake monster, taking care of that threat as well. We need to get access to the alien ruins next, but they're firmly sealed behind a large metal door. Lucky for us, there's a disassembled missile lying on the ground near the mercenary ship. We need to take it apart and run the explosive to the door before it goes off. This part can be very unforgiving. You have very little extra time to get the bomb where it needs to be without it blowing up in your face. But with that done, we can step through a gateway that removes our biosuit, and we're once again our cyborgy self. On the floor is Dr. Escher being attacked by an alien bug creature. We take it out, heal her with the healing spray, and chat with the wounded doctor. She lets us know that the tech keeping us alive is not purely human, and we're part alien ourselves now. Not entirely surprising. She is too weak to move, but gives us an alien translator we can use in the temple outside. Here we learn a lot about the history of the Fix. Turns out their race also believed in advancement through controlled evolution, and reached a point in their society where they purposefully evolved their race down two separate paths. One smaller sect of leaders, and a larger sect of soldiers and workers who would be subservient to the leader class. Yeah, I can't see how that would go wrong. Of course, this led to eventual wars, and the destruction of most of their race. The alien rampaging around destroying the moon base is one of those soldiers. His rage at his lot in life is probably well justified. Some of the Fix put themselves into a sleep state to await a time when their great leader, Jen, would awaken and guide them back to greatness. Moving on from here, we are assaulted once again by the enraged alien soldier. This time we have no tricks, and we need to take him on in hand-to-hand combat. After a lot of crotch and head kicks, the alien finally realizes he can't win and retreats into the gravity tube system. We can follow and find this crater has a series of these tubes for fast travel. There is a part here when chasing the alien where we have to use our gun in a low gravity area. And let me tell you, this part sucks. If you thought getting around in this game normally was tough, it is so much worse here. Shooting your gun in the opposite direction you want to move should be fairly straightforward in concept, but the fixed camera angle just changes constantly, and the gun moving you seems to just be a matter of random chance. Sometimes you shoot and it barely moves you an inch. Other times, it will just full-on launch you across the stratosphere. It is a chore, but it's thankfully a short section. In the next room, we come across our alien nemesis for the last time. It's a pretty anticlimactic fight, but he does have a cool shield cube we can steal when we win. In the next room, we're able to awaken the alien leader Jen, who's been slumbering for thousands of years. He can sense the imminent destruction of the planet, and wants your assistance in getting himself and the few remaining Fix off-world. We need to realign the planet's gravity rings before we'll be able to escape. He also gives us a powerful alien battery we'll need to power the ship from earlier. Still a bit to do, but for the first time it seems like we may actually escape this nightmare. Moving back through the gravity tubes, 2 Marines have arrived at the temple from earlier to try and find us. We can use the controls here to drop a heavy alien orb on one of their heads. Then when the survivor throws a grenade down the tube to retaliate, we can toss it back to blow him up as well. Another memorable set piece to replace what could have just been a boring standard combat encounter. With that threat neutralized, we can move to the gravity rings. This puzzle involves stepping on these floor switches to align the highlighted parts of the ring in the background, all while dodging flying projectiles. This part was actually extremely difficult, mostly because the perspective here is a mess, and it would be nearly impossible to tell where the various space rocks were actually heading. Regardless, several grisly deaths later, we get the combo right, which aligns the gravity rings and gives us a clear shot of getting off-world. On our return through the temple, we find Dr. Escher is missing, but her logbook is here. Very little new information is present in it, but we do get the access code to Dr. Mastaba's medical records back in the main base. We finally have the means to figure out who we are. On the way back to the medical lab, we take out a few more Marines and find another dropship here escaping. On our radio, it is Dr. Mastaba, and he has captured Dr. Escher. He plans to use her to continue his experiments, turn her into a cyborg like he did to us. We yell at him a lot, but ultimately he escapes and there is seemingly nothing we can do. Bummer. Back in the doctor's lab, we now have full access to the medical files of all of his victims, including how far into the process each got and what they died of. Only one actually survived, and his name is Blake Rathman. This is us. We were apparently something known as a berserker. And we were kidnapped from our home for genetic experimentation after we were found to have a rare tissue type required for cybernetic enhancement. I have to admit, I expected a little more for our backstory after spending the whole game wondering who we are. Like there was a logbook we found earlier where they introduced the leader of the Mondites, someone known as the Paragon, who espouses the need for evolution at all costs. I really thought we were going to end up being him, or at least end up having some sort of revelation or twist. Turns out we were literally just some dude who got kidnapped. There is an interesting part of the doctor's logbook that describes the memory wiping process. As part of a check and balance to make sure the process worked, people who have their memory wiped gain the ability to play the flute. This explains why we could play the flute we found in Dane's cell. It's a weird little detail they didn't need to include in the game, but I'm glad they did. Anyhow, our past revealed, all that's left is to escape the planet. We can take the alien battery we got from Jen earlier and plug it into the experimental craft we found ages ago. With that done, we get one last cinematic of ourselves and the remaining fixed spacecraft fleeing the planet moments before the reactor goes critical and blows it up. And sadly, that's the end of the story. I was hoping for some conclusion with Dr. Mastaba and Dr. Escher, but I guess the mad surgeon really does just get away with it, and will simply continue his twisted work elsewhere. A bit of a missed opportunity, I think, but I guess considering the grim dark nature of the entire affair, we should just be happy we didn't end up as food for a lake monster. I'm skipping the review section today, because if I'm being real, there are only two things that people seem to dislike about this game. It's either A, the game was buggy and they couldn't get it running properly, or B, they complain about how wildly dated this game is and how it's completely inaccessible to a modern audience. For the first point, all I can say is that this game ran perfectly fine straight out of the box using the GOG version. Even when running with recording software, which for reference can cause issues with DOSBox, it was completely fine. I may have just gotten lucky, but no problems for compatibility on my end. As to the game being so dated as to be inaccessible, yeah, that's completely true. Like, I had a great time with Bioforge, but saying this game isn't a product of its time would be a lie. As one of the earliest examples of full 3D in computer gaming, this title is absolutely dated. The mechanics and controls are a mess. You move like absolute garbage, and at the best of times, combat feels more like you're making suggestions than actually controlling the action. Much of this can be forgiven for two main reasons. One is just how heavily scripted the game is. You can really trial and error your way through even the worst encounters. Secondly, this game is short, and I'm talking like 2 or 3 hours short. So putting up with some wonky gameplay mechanics to get through can sort of be tolerated. Despite that, it's hard to get past the fact that this game is rough. And while it now holds a super memorable place in my mind, I truly wouldn't recommend the title to someone who isn't really interested in the retro scene. You can watch a no commentary playthrough of this game in just a couple of hours and save yourself a lot of the headache of the experience. To me, the game gives off this weird feeling that if it had released a few years later, closer to the year 2000 when 3D technology was more developed and the rules were more set, that it could have been a massive success. But unfortunately, it will instead stand in history as an overly ambitious project that, while extremely unique and worthy of attention, will never be more than a passing curiosity to the modern audience. A stepping stone on the way to better things. If you do think you have the patience for it and decide to play, I would almost recommend a walkthrough to help smooth out some of the cracks in the gameplay. Fun fact, the GOG version actually comes with the full strategy guide. But ultimately, it's up to you if you decide the story and the atmosphere are worth the effort. If you do decide to play, make sure you keep your battery charged and your head on a swivel. See you in the next video.